There's this expression in the life of the church, which, as far as I can tell, seems to be getting more and more attention these days. As far as I know, it was coined by Archbishop Fulton Sheen to describe what the church teaches about a final deception that the faithful will have to endure before the second coming of Christ. He called it the ape of the church, which would be like this apocalyptic counterfeit church, which would be inaugurated by the Antichrist himself. In his book, Communism and the Conscience of the West, speaking about the Antichrist, he said, "His religion will be a brotherhood without the fatherhood of God. He will deceive even the elect. He will set up a counter church, which will be the ape of the church, because he, the devil, is the ape of God. It will have all the notes and characteristics of the church, but in reverse and emptied of its divine content." And more than a few people have taken this to be a description of where we seem to be at in history as a church today. In fact, when I went to go look for this quote so that I could copy it and share it in this video, the first website I found on it was a sedevacantist website, which claims that ever since Vatican II, the church has been in this state of apostasy, and that this quote from Fulton Sheen is one more piece of evidence to support that claim. And it wasn't just Fulton Sheen who claimed that the church would suffer such a rival. It's actually well established in church teaching. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in Article 7 says, "Before Christ's second coming, the church must pass through a final trial that will shake the faith of many believers. The persecution that accompanies her pilgrimage on earth will unveil the mystery of iniquity in the form of a religious deception, offering men an apparent solution to their problems at the price of apostasy from the truth. The supreme religious deception is that of the Antichrist, a pseudo-messianism by which man glorifies himself in the place of God." The Catechism goes on to say that this religious deception will claim to realize within history our messianic hope that can only actually be realized beyond history in the life of the world to come. So that is to say that the Antichrist will promise us the fulfillment of our longings here and now in history rather than in the next life and the restoration of all things that come after the second coming of Jesus. And so when we hear and read things like that, it's easy to start to eagerly look for signs that suggest this is happening right now in front of us. We see unfaithful bishops, a pretty dramatic falling away from people from the church, an unmistakable rise in secularism in our culture, and a migration of our hope from the next life to what can be gained here and now. And we say, well, does that mean that the Antichrist is also already on the stage promoting this counter church? I think there's also a strong desire, maybe you could even call it a temptation, for faithful Christians to want to see this unfolding right now. After all, this life is a pilgrimage of waiting in large measures. We're waiting for Christ to return. We're waiting for our ultimate transformation. We're waiting for an end to suffering. And who likes waiting? When you're anticipating something, especially something good, you prefer that it happens sooner than later. Like when you're in a waiting room of some kind, think about like being in a doctor's waiting room and the person stands up to call the next person in line. It's easy to over anticipate that she's gonna call my name and then the wait will be over, right? So I think it's really important for us to be on our guard that we not fall prey to our impatience and our wish for the wait to be over, because if that wish goes unchecked, we may find ourselves falling victim to poor judgments about what signs we are seeing in our present moment in history. For example, if your eagerness for that wait to come to an end could more easily convince you of the claims of those who say that the current pope is a false pope or that the church is in a state of apostasy, well, then the implications of that are pretty severe. We have a lot more to lose in a wager like that if we're wrong. So how do we remain on our guard? Well, I would say that if you're going to take an interest in this topic, we have to make sure that we're not simply resting our laurels on one claim or one passage from a Fulton Sheen book or one argument from a YouTube video that we might see online. When we hear something like that, and then when it's followed up with a claim like, therefore the current pope is actually an anti-pope, considering the seriousness of that conclusion, we then have to be more serious in our investigation. For example, how many people would hear a claim like that and then go read the relevant passages in, say, Scripture or the Catechism in their full context? Because if not, That's a pretty dangerous attitude to just casually allow yourself to be persuaded by. And I would add, extremely dangerous in its implications. Considering the consequences, don't we owe it to ourselves, to the fate of our eternal souls, to spend at least 10 minutes reading the Catechism to see if all of this actually checks out? Because that's what I did. And if the claim is that what is currently known as the Catholic Church is the ape of the Antichrist, well, there are definitely some problems with that claim when you do this investigation. The first is one of obvious chronology, because the Church has always held, and you'll find this in that same article in the Catechism, that prior to the counterfeit deception, this ape of the Church, the full measure of the Gentiles will be converted, and recognition of all of Israel that Jesus is the Messiah. That means the Jews will all be converted first. And the last time I checked, the Jews haven't all been converted to Christianity yet. This is also an interesting anecdote from history, or an interesting point from history, if you'll allow me, because whenever there have been violent outbreaks against Jews in like Christian nations, the Church has often stepped in to protect them for this exact reason, knowing that their conversion is an essential ingredient in the second coming of Jesus. So if genocidal efforts towards them were to succeed, then the second coming couldn't happen. So while there have always been tensions between the Church or just Christians and Jews, the Church's official teaching about them is that they are an essential ingredient in God's plan for restoring the world to himself. Something else to notice about what we should expect from the Antichrist's counterfeit church is that it will be a secular messianism. That's what the Catechism says. And remember that the word secular means without religious content. And whatever else you might say about the state of the Church today, it is still devoted to God, even if you think those devotions are insufficient. It isn't as though the Church has abandoned prayer, the sacraments, the fact of God as the creator, the doctrine of the Trinity, the resurrection, and the divinity of Jesus. For all the complaints a person could make about the Catholic Church today, claiming that it is an institution like atheistically devoted to the concerns of this life and not eternal life is pretty impossible to hold. What those promoting this view that the Church is in a state of apostasy and that the popes since Vatican II are actually anti-popes, the reason that they make this claim is because that they believe that the Church has fallen into heresy, and therefore it is this false ape of the Antichrist. But this, again, isn't compatible with what we know about the Antichrist's deception. Not only will it be characterized by a secular messianism, it will be antithetical to Christ's church, just as the Antichrist will be antithetical to Christ himself. Again, remember what Sheen said himself. It will have all the notes and characteristics of the church, but in reverse. Now, I'm not a fan of heresy, but it's important to remember that heresy isn't antithetical to the faith. It isn't the opposite of what we believe. It's always a variation of what we believe in the form of a distortion. For example, we as Catholics, and I'm sorry to my Protestant brothers and sisters, but I think we can both admit that we both think the other is holding to heretical doctrine. So for Catholics, the Protestant error is that we are saved by faith alone, rather than faith working through love. But faith alone isn't the opposite of the truth. It's just a slight enough variation that Christians of goodwill can mistake it for the real thing, which is why heresy can be so dangerous. The deception of the Antichrist won't just be some heresy, it will be a temptation to a wholesale rejection of the true promises of Christ in the world to come. And again, we need to remember that Christ himself promised to be with us, with the church, until the end of the age, safeguarding it so that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And if Scripture's promises and the promises of Christ himself aren't enough, Vatican I, the First Vatican Council, infallibly and explicitly says that the gift of truth and never failing faith was conferred on Peter and his successors in this see. And whether you like it or not, John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul the 2nd, Benedict the 16th, and now Francis are his successors. They are the ones who succeed him and sit in that Holy See. To argue that they are not valid successors because they have lost the faith as evidence that they have lost the faith is to argue in circles. It's textbook circuitous reasoning. The promises of Christ and the dogma of the church make that impossible, or Christ's promises have no substance, and in which case there's no point in keeping up this whole charade of being a Christian. If you're a Catholic who is a leader in your profession, and you're like me, you've probably had some desire for more opportunities to network with other Catholic professional leaders in order to help each other grow professionally, spiritually, and economically. Because this is exactly what we're doing with Fisher's Network. We're mobilizing Catholic professionals and economic leaders into local crews so that they can better support one another in the hopes of building up something like a local Catholic economy. As they do so, they can better support their parish in a variety of ways. Imagine as a parish having a group of experts you can turn to for advice and support on business decisions that have to be made. This is why pastors participate in our crews as well. They get business mentorship while having the opportunity to build up leaders in their community. So if this sounds like a way to strengthen your local Catholic community or parish, consider becoming a member by visiting fishersnetwork.com.